What I would like to do today is going to be very short, relatively, and I'd rather describe it as an introduction to debate, because it is rather the debate which interests me, and I think also you taking part in this today session. I think we had already enough of the well-structured monologues, which always end up with kind of exhaustion of different, rather sometimes incompatible point of view. And the main thing is hardly starting. I'm concerned and I'm puzzled by many things which this symposium might bring to light. I would like to refer to the title of the lecture and start perhaps with the notion which for me is rather a question mark. Architecture is incurable, I would say possibility of both curable or incurable disease. I see architecture as something which is rather for us an open question itself with very big question mark in the end. The thing which comes to mind first, and it is only in that sense that I will be using some of my references here, is a letter which you probably come across already once, at least somewhere, and which I found still very, very interesting and revealing. It's a letter which was written just a few days, literally a few days before the opening of London exhibition 1851, from Brunel to Wyatt. And Brunel is saying, I'm going to design in a great hurry, and I believe to build a station after my own fancy, that is, with engineering rules, etc., etc. It is at Paddington in a cutting. Now, such a thing will be entirely metal as to all the general forms, arrangements, and design. It almost of necessity becomes an engineering work. But to be honest, even if it were not, it is a branch of architecture of which I am fond, and of course believe myself fully competent for. But for detail of ornamentation, I neither have time nor knowledge, and with all my confidence in my own ability, I have never any objection to advice and assistance, even in the department which I keep to myself, namely the general design. Now, in this building, which between us will be one of the largest of its class, I want to carry out strictly and fully all those correct notions of the use of metal, which I believe you and I share, except that I shall carry them still further than you. And I think it will be a nice opportunity. Are you willing to enter upon the work professionally in the subordinate capacity? So it goes. If you are disposed to accept my offer, can you be with me this evening, etc., etc., yours truly, Brunel. I think it is just the crudity of the tone, attitude, and also the honesty of approach, which seems to separate us from that very stage of affairs. I'd like to start with slides. Oh, is it here? Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay. Oh. Just as a reminder, the situation which we happen to be in is different only in degree. What seems to have changed is the scale. The crudity has been substituted with a very gentle disguise of the major conflict, and the honesty with something which people would like to call sometimes ideology, sometimes confusion or obscurity of the very relationship between what is not architecture, how far it goes to the sphere of industrial design, how far it goes strictly into the sphere of engineering, etc. I think that most of the debate we have been having so far is rather sterile as long as we're trying to understand all those controversial issues on just one level. I think the answer is not to look at it, as it were, horizontally. Nothing like design in the sphere of industry, the sphere of architecture in traditional sense, can be compared on one level. What I would like to introduce here is what can be described as vertical understanding of the whole problem. In other words, the problem of the visibility which we're traditionally dealing with, how the particular issue comes to the level of drawing board, when one can see when I can deal with phenomena in their, as it were, tangible visual form. But that's only one side of it. The other side is what some might describe as the sphere of invisibles. If you walk in the almost finished now Centre Beaubourg, one is slightly puzzled, especially knowing a little bit about the program, a little bit about the background, and what is going to be there in a few months' time. The richness of the world, which the Centre is supposed to represent in the end, is somehow invisible. And one can see already that the finished building would not change very much on that. It is the whole spheres, I would say not one, but series of spheres, which each of them is beautifully articulated. If you take the section of visual arts, this consists of practically the whole Museum of Modern Art, as it exists today, Musée d'Art Moderne, plus series of small studios, laboratories, and other spaces where a lot of current events would ultimately take place. Now, the building itself does not really say very much about that. One can go from one section of it to another. It is almost like an unwritten dream world if one reads the scenario. And it is slightly different situation of reality when it comes back to the building, which is impressive, probably mainly in its size, in its sophistication of some detail in structure. But altogether, it is something like a large boat which seems to be floating on the Parisian scene without too much relationship with the rest of the town, and certainly not reminding very much of the culture as one knows it from the Parisian scene still today. The verticality, as I have been indicating, is something which has very much to do, I think, with our perplexity today, the perplexity how to read from one level of experience to another, how to simply understand what seemed to be, or previously did take place on drawing board or on the canvas or on simply in the object of art itself. The generation of early 20th century has been fully aware of it and not only puzzled but also trying to find some possible answer. I think one of the most interesting period was from the 1913 to the early 20s. I find always very, very fascinating the short period of Dada, between Dada and Surrealism, the period between Man Ray, Picabia, Duchamp, and the full explicit formulation of the Surrealist programs in early 20s. Somewhere on the line, one comes across a series of very interesting collages which seem to be still one of the best kind of summary or key to the dilemma, if you like, or discontinuity of the vertical structure of modern culture. Hilsenbeck's portrait of Tatlin is probably telling the whole story just in visual level. Nevertheless, one has to go to the text and has to be slightly more inquisitive about the background in order to grasp the full meaning of the feeling, experience, and the anxiety which goes with that very period. It is basically a question of the very ambiguity of our possibilities, powers, and limits. It is a question to what extent we can really ultimately find the affinity with the world which is already given around, and all the dreams which are rather secret, dreams which still would refer rather to some state of innocence, state of a possible reconciliation with the rest of the reality. And it is, I think, from that point that one looks again on the whole period of 20th century, rather as a series of attempts to bring together the growing, incredibly vast and fascinating sphere of invisible culture. I don't want to sound very abstract or very in a very kind of formal in my statements. One would have to obviously support each word by the richness of contemporary literature, contemporary philosophy, and contemporary art, which is obviously impossible to bring into a quick illustration, which, as one knows, is always something to be mediated. It is not the kind of direct experience one can just show, look at, and remain silent in understanding. The 20th century is permanently, as it were, haunted by the dilemma of knowing about and seeing what can be understood. I would like to mention something which seems to me of absolutely crucial importance and something which will hopefully throw in the debate a very different light on our current, as it were, ghost-like situation. The questions which we're asking, the questions about the notion, meaning, and the whole simply existence of architecture with apocalyptic conclusions of deaths of the discipline on one end. On the other end, the whole belief and rather optimistic, I would say slightly naive, optimistic belief in something like revival of architecture in purely autonomous sphere. So putting both together, it is the kind of direct head-on collision between two very different worlds. One rather gloomy and pessimistic and more or less giving up to what is inevitable and accepting it for granted that after all we are facing something which is almost fatal, which can be described as technocratic nightmare or whatever instead, but something which is unavoidable. On the other side, the kind of optimism which obviously we would probably share rather likely more. And nevertheless, the gap in between, I cannot avoid to bring in an issue which is very much on that line and which would hopefully, as I indicated, throw a very different light on that very conflict. But issue which I cannot illustrate, which I have to only very briefly describe, and which probably would help us to understand that those two spheres are rather two sides of one coin, and it is rather to grasp the coin than permanently referring to the superficiality of the two sides and leading superficiality which leads inevitably to the endless and rather useless debates. The key to the dilemma I see in the transformation or shift, if you like, of the very notion of the architectural reality. The letter I read at the beginning, in a very naive way and rather primitive way, gives an indication that it is rather beyond. It is something which we have only recently, began only recently to understand, grasp. And it is something which is still extremely difficult to bring on Anglo-Saxon sphere or Anglo-Saxon kind of, into the Anglo-Saxon culture debate. It's a problem which probably makes the continent still the very different cultural sphere from the Anglo-Saxon and particularly the English one. The key category or key notion or image, if you like, is the very controversial word of functionalism. And it goes with one name, Gottfried Semper, who in the middle of 19th century, about the same time as Brunner wrote his letter to Wyatt, have been silently formulating very curious, rather mad to some, but in the end extremely influential piece of thinking. It is not a philosophy. It is a practical approach, it's an attempt to produce very systematically something like a practical aesthetics. The name might be very obscure, but never mind. What is important is that it was Semper who stands really behind the whole tradition of continental schools of applied arts, the tradition which goes through the end of 19th century and which becomes the key to what is known as Bauhaus tradition in Germany, to a certain extent the Purist tradition in France, and certainly all schools of 20th century, schools of applied art, etc., as they've been influencing later the sphere of United States and rest of the world. I don't want to go through the whole bulk of Semper's thinking. I'd like to summarize only a few points which are decisive and which I hope would provide a base for some of the more interesting points in the current debate. Semper is trying to somehow get away, radically away, from the confusion of revivals on one end. On the other side, he was trying also to find a substitute to the continuity of figurative tradition in architecture, which was flourishing until the end of 18th century. I don't know, we probably are not still very well aware of the real crisis of the early 19th century, the crisis which started with the end of so-called Vitruvian tradition. These are all, to us, rather archaeological names, but what is behind it is quite interesting and I think rather fascinating, that with all the end of 18th century debates and critique and refusals, suddenly in the end, the complete dissolution and erosion of the previous tradition, one thing has been lost, and it was a very crucial one. I can put it into one word. It was the notion of architecture as a figurative art, the notion of architecture which still carries with a reference to some kind of a totality, some kind of a whole. I don't say more than really just one sentence, that the whole sphere of so-called orders is beyond its dreary and rather boring surface, something which is incredibly rich and incredibly vital for the basic rules, if you like, the basic ultimate order or court of appeal, which managed to mediate all the figurative aspects and problems of architecture. Now, the richness of that, of course, cannot be described in a very short way. I can only summarize, again, in few words, that all the issues of reconciliation, in very general sense, have been ultimately mediated by the notion of order itself. The time when all that has appeared, of course, can be described or can be seen only as a vacuum. And it is very curious to see how the vacuum has been gradually filled. I'll come back to that slide and rather illustrate my point, my next point. Sorry. The real relevance of the period known as Revolutionary architecture, or period of revolutionary architects, can be appreciated only on the background of the vacuum which I have very briefly indicated or very briefly described. The possibility of substituting the implicit meaning, the implicit articulatedness, simply the figurative qualities of architecture itself, was substituted by an attempt to formulate something which I would call a mathematics of the visible, the systematic development of an iconography which can be read, as it were, almost one-to-one between object and particular experience. We know that attempt under notions like character. The character is something which directly then belongs to a particular building, and it is through the systematic development of the characters which build up the vocabulary known mainly through the Beaux-Arts tradition, and later on we'll see that it will play a very important role in all the revivals in 20th century, including our current attempts to go back to some kind of an identifiable vocabulary, or if you like, language. It would be a very decisive element in all the tendencies of rationalists today, especially the Italian group Tendenza. And I think it is rather that moment, the moment of developing more systematically, or developing systematically, a substitute for the existing order in whatever sense, traditional or the 19th and 20th century attempts, to build an iconography, to build some kind of a possible framework which would provide ultimately an answer to the dilemma of figurative and non-figurative, or if you like, the dilemma of the visible and invisible in design today. In case of Boulez, it was even more interesting because it almost summarized the whole problem in also another very important aspect, the aspect which illustrates affinity between arts as visual arts and the most developed and advanced sphere of invisible, which was contemporary science. It is not by coincidence that the dominating, as it were, object, image, or almost an obsession of Boulez was just the very kenotaph for Newton. And just very briefly, the way the issue is treated illustrates very well, I hope, my point. It is an attempt to bring the most invisible, if you like, esoteric aspect of the current Newtonian science, already developed into a complete Laplacian system of celestial mechanics, as an ultimate answer to the mystery of the invisible, down to the level of a visible, tangible object, which can be seen again, or ultimately in the end, as a piece of architecture. It is interesting that the whole issue has been treated, as several others in that time, as parallels, day and night, as parallels of the, what we would call diurnal and nocturnal. It is at the same time a dream which is following, we would like to say, the order of possible art or poetics. On the other side, it is an order of full consciousness and light, which would follow the order of the current science. And bringing them together, he's using the kind of ambiguity of dream, reality, of the imaginary and real, the invisible and visible, as a vehicle for developing systematically his vocabulary and developing what might be the substitution of the non-existent orders. I would like to refer back to the period again of the middle of 19th century, and with the problem being grasped but not answered by the generation of 1800, we can see the 19th century as permanent attempt to find the answer and solution how to live in those two worlds, in other words, how to cope with the established schizophrenia. The existing or the traditional or established cliché of talking about engineering or engineering architecture and talking about architecture as a high art is something which covers only the surface. It was through the piece of thinking I mentioned on the line, and Semper happened to appear already as a name, that we can get more deeper insight into the very dilemma. Semper has been trying to formulate an approach which would cover at the same time all the aspects which science might deal with and already at that time dealt with, such as structure, etc., but on the other side also the notion of meaning, articulatedness, the problem of figuration, the accommodation or development of the notion of character into a very consistent notion of theory, if you like, philosophy of meaning, which is applicable to the current daily problems. I would mention only a few, probably one or two, of his major contributions. One of them is the notion which in German goes first as the Stoffwechseltheorie. It's a very curious piece of thinking, very profound. In English translation, it would go as a translation of materials, or transformation of materials, replacement, if you like, of materials. But it's very much kind of intrinsic notion which tries to grasp all the aspects which constitute form and ultimately produce form in a particular milieu, if you like, milieu of material, techniques, conditions, and so on. One can see it very simply as an attempt to cope with all the given reality. Doesn't matter how directly or indirectly one can grasp it. Now, on the other side, it is an attempt to understand the possibility how meaning really comes to light, how symbols, for instance, are really constituted, and so on. And his conclusion is very simply as follows, that through the very complex process of conditioning, inverted comma, there is a certain achievement in terms of form, which is a ultimate balanced reconciliation of all the constitutive elements of the process. And the form is something like a sublimation. We are not very far here from the understanding of sublimation in psychoanalysis. It is really the way we ourselves experience that it is through, in fact, the directly given, that we're coming to less directly given, and in the end, possibly to understand, grasp, appreciate the invisibles. The Stoffwechseltheorie of Semper was directly responsible for the early 20th century German specialist situation. People like Behrens were profoundly influenced, and most of all Mies. I think the Mies is something which is permanently for us a headache. We would like to dismiss it as we did some years ago. On the other side, one cannot very easily avoid the issue. It comes again and again and again. What is puzzling about it is, on one side, the appearance which seemed to come very easily as a category of some kind of a modified, cultivated, or perfected engineering. But at the same time, one knows that there is something more, and the something more is always extremely difficult to grasp. The something more is what we perhaps can call a symbolic value, the symbolic meaning of the engineering, inverted comma, engineering piece of architecture. If you go slowly and with certain patience through the writing of Semper, you probably would appreciate from a very different perspective what really Mies was very much after. The sublimation is in the end directly experienced or experienceable in the appearance of his own projects, especially the early ones from 20s, where there is something like a almost utopian, dreamlike, perhaps imaginary, to grasp something which is beyond, as it were, the given, beyond the material itself. The choice of glass is again not incidental. It is through glass that the dilemma, the ambiguity of being given and being sublimated to something different through its transparency, through its reflections, and so on, is permanently present. One can obviously start talking about the problem of glass and its role in 20s in relation to Semper for more than half an hour or 1 hour. But again, if I can just summarize what is relevant, what seems to me at least relevant for us today, is the open, almost utopian attempt to bring together the poles of the schizophrenic cultural situation, the dreamlike possibilities of current science, technology, etc., and thinking in general, On the other side, the concreteness, the given, the materiality, if you like, the embodiment, what is really tangible, and what can be dealt with in a direct design manner. The glass has something like a mystique and also pragmatics. And I think it is in that one can start reading the more profound meaning of the whole confrontation or permanent, rather growing conflict. I would like to at the same time make a comment, at least short comment, about the kind of framework in which the issue begins to develop. Looking from inside, one can understand that the problem of sublimation had certain possibilities, and one can also grasp some of the Art Nouveau attempts to use it rather intuitively. And if you remember some of the cases, the more kind of sublime, as it were, or the more advanced cases of design, examples of design, such as Horta in particular, one is kind of present to a certain solutions, certain answer, but rather terminating by the limit of the method as far as the framework is concerned. It is always related to a particular material, particular sphere. The cultivation of iron, the cultivation of steel, of concrete, of glass, into a context which would represent at least a set or ground for designing a building is obviously or seen to be available. But what is not available is the framework in full scale, the framework which we can describe or see as a problem of space in its full sense. And it's, I think, at that point that the notion of sublimation, the notion which Semper have been thinking about, the problems he has been preoccupied with, and which has contributed to begin to make more sense again. The second, apart from his theory of the Stock-Wechsel theory, was the notion of a architecture as a ultimate reconciliation. The term sounds very general and not saying very much, but it was a reconciliation in terms of homogeneity, in terms of certain kind of non-contradictoriness, if you like, of the whole world of architecture, not just architecture in its material being, as a fabric or as a building, as a cluster complex, etc., but as building in its more than just individual symbolic sense, but building as a culture phenomenon in the widest possible sense. And I think it is here that we coming again across the duality of the dilemma in a very interesting, in very interesting sort of way. The notion of space has been almost split into two halves. Space which one can touch, which you can see, which one can follow as a given simultaneity of present elements, phenomena, arcades, windows, cornices, etc., simply the body of the building. But on the other side, it is a space which is present, which indicates its existence, but already is beyond. The whole domain or world of arcades, of large span halls, of exhibition halls, the whole mythology, if you like, of world exhibition in the 19th century is nothing but illustration of that very interesting aspect of the conflict. One can only remember the interiors of the Crystal Palace in its very kind of contradictory form, the tangible inside, the structure in its silent present, and then the transparent world which goes beyond the building and in again, the two-dimensionality, if you like, or two different levels of reality of the space as it presented there. One can obviously extend it from such a small scale into a large and talk about Victorian city in those terms, but this would be another debate, and I don't want to go into today. What I find interesting, especially in that illustration, is the very, very kind of definite demonstration of the problem. The Euston Station, the original building, has been built, as you know, into a curve. And I think the structure already says that the space here is quite clearly on two different levels. It is the building itself, which you can walk in and you can touch, as it were, directly. And then there is a space which has no particular beginning and no particular end. It can be extended. It is a space which is not only transparent in the terms I have been talking so far, but it's a space which has no particular tangible definition. It is a space which can almost continue, as it were, ad absurdum. It is a space which is, if I can use one word, conceptual. It's a concept, rather. You can draw it, you can calculate it, and you can multiply, and nothing, in principle, very much would happen. It is already a place, as it were, altogether in the end, which is, as it were, given for two types of experiences. One, when you see, and one, when you can just think about it and continue it, like an infinite polygon. To make it slightly more complicated, I would like to introduce now another issue, and probably the last for today, the notion of, or develop at least, the notion of the oneric side. The conceptual space, which appears in the Euston and which appears in all the transparent structure of 19th and early 20th century, has something like a counterpart in the full-scale oneric architecture of dreams, if you like, architecture which goes back to innocence of paradise and the mythology of return, or eternal, in the end, possibility of eternal return. One can obviously refer to the whole expressionist tradition going from 20th century back to a romantic tradition of 19th, etc., and include Gaudi on the way, and so on. But one of the best examples I would still refer to is Maison Idéale, the Palais Idéal by Factor Cheval. It is something which, as it were, almost ignores the sophistication, ignores the felt and recognized dilemmas I have been so far talking about, and starts from scratch with naivete but confidence of creating world of its own. Someone like Tafuri would probably describe it as a sublime uselessness. It is an object, it's a building which has no particular purpose, and deliberately not so. It is not monument in established sense. It is not house, it is not really palais. It is just a dream, materialized dream, and a priori, the only meaning and the only purpose why the building comes to existence is the materialization of the dream itself for the sake of it. The connotations or the illustrations in text and his own writings, which are on the walls around, are only confirming what I'm saying. I think you are familiar with that example, so one doesn't have to go into the more detailed interpretation. I would like rather to conclude and rather use it as a reminder of a whole tradition which begins to develop somewhere around the middle of 19th century and which will become much more powerful in the early 20s and again after the war, 45, and perhaps even more so in current times now. It is not really the appearance which we usually refer to, and I would like rather to diminish the meaning of it. It is rather the principle, the possibility that architecture in the end can be created as a piece of a private reference, if you like, or private dream. In other words, turning the mythology in a broader sense into a very narrow notion of mythology, dream as a myth in very privatized sense. Coming to the very controversial 20s and after, the controversial notion of international style modern movement in full, I'd like to make it even more so and perhaps introduce it straight with a very provocative kind of introduction which I made through the example of Factor Cheval Palais Ideal. I believe that it is through that sphere or through that domain that we can grasp some of the more interesting, important, and in the end perhaps the more relevant aspect of 20s and 30s. It is rather through the private dream, if you like, dream which might have been by some generalized and turned into a full culture program. Nevertheless, it remained a series of rather private dreams which would in the end move beyond the sphere of purely oniric and try to use the dreamlike basis as a vehicle or as a bridge for the schizophrenia which I have been mentioning at the beginning. One has to only go through writings, drawings, preparatory sketches, the so-called mathematical sketches of Juan Gris and some of his contemporaries. But Juan Gris itself would be a very definite example illustrating my point about the oniric origins of the whole generational period, of the achievement, rather, of the period of the generation of early 20s and around the First World War. One can ask, of course, very prosaic question or very straightforward question: what kind of dream is behind? What kind of dream is behind what seemed to be so far and has been interpreted as purely rational or highly rational, advanced, ideal piece of thinking, and in the end something which has been labeled as mathematics of art? I'd like to remind ourselves, or just make it more clear, that the whole notion of mathematics itself is rather something which in 19th century changed its meaning. And mathematics, if I want to understand it in modern sense, has to be read through rather people like late 18th century thinkers. And perhaps one of the better examples would be someone like the romantic poet Novalis in Germany, who was a mathematician himself and who wanted to rather provide a base through mathematics for the new synthesis, filling the vacuum, which in architecture happened to appear as a vacuum of figurativeness, and later on in visual arts as well, and in culture in general appeared probably, if I want to use just one word, in the problem of absurd, the problem of recognized and fully experienced conflict of the invisible and visible in the modern world. That it has absolutely crucial meaning for art, and in its oniric sense in particular, one can illustrate by the nice story of meeting between Dirac and Oppenheimer. When the old man met Oppenheimer, he was nicely surprised that Oppenheimer is writing a poetry, but in the end rather disgusted by the fact that he's putting so much emphasis on it. And as he defined it, you are a man, he was saying to Oppenheimer, who is trying, like me, to discover what nobody knows and make it understandable. While the poets would do probably just the very opposite. They would define or would pick up what everybody knows and try to make it non-understandable. I don't want to go further beyond that point, but I would like to say that the whole dilemma, the whole mystery, if you like, of what is not architecture in terms of art is probably very much on that line. And I'm slightly afraid to go beyond because it would really be another talk. Perhaps we might use some of the time of the debate to comment more on it. The notion of honoring the notion of dream and the notion of mathematical, or mathematics being based on the dreamlike ground, one can sense through all the better achievements of the 20s, 30s, and the generation of that time. I cannot resist the feeling, or cannot resist always the kind of conclusion whenever faced with some of the later works by Korb, that it is in then the key to understand the, as it were, surface prosaics, the type of Korb or kind of Korb which can be reduced to a set of rules, or the debate about space, aprelekibism, and all the derivative kind of notions and debates from that. I think there is something behind which one can feel going, for instance, on the terrace in Champs-Élysées, the Vestegui apartment, which he converted around 1930, and which is always interpreted with certain unease. I haven't got a slide of it, but you probably remember the three terraces, which one of them would simulate almost a Rococo boudoir in a very, very sublimated illusions. The other one would appear like a current terrace of a penthouse, and altogether they'll be linked with a series of connections which goes partly beyond the building or the cluster itself, would refer to certain elements on the Parisian scene, and in a circle back to the place when one stands. There are some attempts to understand, or perhaps read or experience, this particular place as almost surrealistic. I don't think one has to go that far and use cheap labels. The key to the whole mystery seemed to me rather in understanding the very ambiguity of the new order, the new framework which had been formulated, and which was rather like a dream which is supposed to be transcended to the sphere of culture as a whole, and the programs which usually in the end sound very pragmatic, very down to earth, but in fact are not very far of utopian dreaming. And it is not only on the large scale. The utopian dreaming is already on the very small scale of the design itself. It is a utopia of achieving something which to us is more and more clear is impossible, to achieve something like a ultimate formal vocabulary, to achieve something like an ultimate order which would fulfill or satisfy all our dreams on one end, but on the other end would come, as it were, in one go to terms with all the richness, articulatedness, and perhaps sometimes paraphernalia of the current world of invisibles. We are not again very far, and rather moving in a circle, perhaps in a certain form of allusions, back to Boulez. It's a very different sense, the relationship between someone like Corbusier and Boulez, than we have been so far reading into that relationship. It is not through the purity of form, it is rather through the framework, through the dream, and through the intentions behind, that there is some relationship between the generation of 1800 and, again, 20s, and perhaps, if one extends the time scale, it would be again with the generation of 70s now. The attempt to reduce the possible sphere of experiences into a set of elements, and elements which appear as it were one-to-one with desirable possible experiences, while at the same time being part of a framework which points behind this not only experience but also behind the world of directly perceptible into a type of framework we might describe as a new type of or contemporary cosmology. I'd like to use one at least or two examples from the details where certain moments I've been hinting on are perhaps more evident. The notions of space, which somewhere on the line I introduced, is probably here illustrated by an attempt or by a tendency to relate together the overall framework of possible space in the most intangible form, which is just sheer movement and transcending the permanent or occasional presence of someone, and the very existence of what is given. One can talk about kind of silence presence of the body of building or the body of architecture in something like an imaginary and almost endless space. The curious and perhaps almost ultimate moments where one cannot simply deny or cannot simply avoid this kind of thought or this kind of understanding or this kind of reading are the, as it were, fringes of the works. Not only of Corp, I can use very similar examples for Mies, and probably even more, nevertheless more controversial, but nevertheless good example from someone like Alvar Aalto. And probably one would be able to continue the debate into a post-war period and take into account people like Louis Kahn, and slightly aside someone like Roberto Venturi. It is always on the fringes that we're becoming aware of the, as it were, unfinished intentions, the unfinished dream, and something like a translation or transformation or regress from the pure logos of the idea, if you like, from the light back to the mythos of the given. The building, if one reads it rightly, has simply no end. It is very puzzling to read it from the surface and from around, as it is usually described, and gradually move as the building leads one to the foundations, where one is faced with nothing but ambiguity. The same applies to all the pilotis on the outside, as much as the inner chapels of the interiors. I think one of the critical step and crucial step in understanding the dilemma of visible-invisible, dilemma of the logical and irrational, mythical, the dilemma of, and I can use now, if you allow me to, last pair of words or terminology terms, techne and poesis, technique and poetry, as we would translate it prosaically. And the decisive step certainly was in 30s. The Surrealists have been probably mostly concerned just with that very haunting issue. The page from the Surrealistic periodical Minotaur and its comments and the background illustrates again very well the recurrent or the recurrence of that very contradiction. It is only when the logical disappears that the dream-like begins to be visible, but nevertheless it only becomes visible because it is already in it. It is present there right from the beginning. I don't know if it matters that this particular picture is left to right, but I don't think necessarily it does. And it is one of the last points I would like to make before we might open some debate. The current scene, as it appears especially in last few years from American perspective. The dichotomy or the dilemma or conflict, if you like, I've been describing is again continued in the transcendence, if you like, of the Corbusian tradition which goes obviously very much beyond and which goes, as it were, back to the core of the issue being, and I can use now one word, Honoric mathematics. The mathematics of the ideal villa would be something like a distant background, but the current and perhaps the most, at the moment, urgent aspect of it is the possibility of extending the relatively narrow and rather utopian framework into a real one, and if you like, realistic one. I'm using the example of Michael Graves, who certainly would be one of the dreamers of the whole group. But if one complements it with an illustration of Richard Meyer's work, and even more so, someone like Vesely, one would probably see the spectrum. And I think the whole debate around the New York Fives, especially looking the same kind of perspective on someone like Richard Meyer on one end and John Haydock on the other hand, is inevitably puzzling as long as we don't understand that there is a common ground. And it is not only that, the common ground would extend, including people like Venturi, and perhaps even beyond, going to East Coast, and including people like Charles Moore, and his colleague from his own circle. Or most important, is the point which refers directly to our current mood of going, as it were, beyond the 20s and 30s and referring to some possible continuity of a new revival either through vernacular, doesn't matter how complex and how in what complex and sublimated form understood, or going to something which is much more precise in its established and fixed European form and the tradition of European culture, neoclassical or classical in the more generous and more open sense. I don't want to use names because I don't think they are very important. What is important is rather our contemporary, the current unease about understanding, about interpreting, about answering it for ourselves, and more or less, in the end, going about our own work. I would like to and conclude on that first point that to me it seems that the whole notion of revival, the whole notion of going beyond 20s, is in fact an illusion of rather based on not seeing that the principles of that very revival, the issues or the items, the icons, the images, the references which appear on that scene are very much the same as the images in principle, again, on the international movement or modern movement in broader sense. And more is true, of course, for the method, or if you like, in the end, for the framework as a whole. It is exactly the same mood. It is the mood of understanding or reconciling the mathematical of the invisibles today with the oniric. Misunderstanding, of course, that the mathematic of our century is, in the end, only itself, and perhaps vice versa. The question can be concluded, or the whole issue can be concluded with kind of provocative, rather reversal of the notion of real and fantastic, real and imaginary. And I would say that what we call real is rather fantastic, and what might be real we still do consider as fantastic or dreamlike. The second point is much more perhaps down to earth, and I guess it would already anticipate some of the talks in these sessions and perhaps part of the debate. It is the point about the possibilities of, I would say the legitimacy perhaps, of the discipline itself. And if one believes that there is something like an affinity between the world I have been describing and the world which I left quite deliberately out, the world of straightforward, rather illusory belief in some kind of a technocratic panacea, this very affinity, of course, would bring us to the point where we have to forget about distinctions and perhaps also about debate and simply accept what is given and what is supposedly taking place anyhow, and come to the point where any question about specificity, distinction between architecture and industrial design engineering, engineering planning, etc., simply are absolutely senseless. I would myself see that the debate, which has been opened mainly by the Italians and to a certain extent responded to by some of the Americans around oppositions, is just about those two major misunderstandings. Because I do consider ultimately that both questions are based, at least the way they are debated today, rather on a mutual conspiracy of misunderstanding itself. And that's where I would stop and leave it for dialogue and multiplication of it.
Something that struck me very forcibly about all the slides, instances which you actually show, the thing that you didn't mention at all was the historical circumstances under which, in particular events, you were talking about arose. And I would suggest that you could have given a similar lecture, or someone could, not you, because I know it was wrong, which actually related the events and instances you talked to being to do with political and social systems, to do with a particular Now it seems to me that the one that the Newton cenotaph arose at a time of a particular crisis in relation to the French aristocracy and the rising strength of the French aristocracy. The incidents of Brunel which you gave and the Great Exhibition arose at a similar time when in fact the bourgeoisie had triumphed in England in 1850. And the problems we talked about around the First World War, which fascinate you also, are also, in my view, related to the same sort of crisis, which is one which we're facing at the moment. Now, I'd just be interested in why it is that you actually embark on a very metaphysical exposition with very little materialist base to your discussion.
Perhaps, quite deliberately, my answer is very straightforward. I appreciate the question, I appreciate the point you're making, but my answer is quite simple, that I would consider political, social, and you can continue, including all the current kind of debated aspects of culture as epiphenomena. I would still like to understand them rather as symptom of something which is much more profound and which doesn't stand necessarily from a politics itself, which doesn't stand necessarily from a economy itself, from a particular event in history itself, and so on. I think, one can do that, and it's very interesting and amusing, but it seems to be rather leading to tautologies. I'm very disappointed by most of the writing which tries to do just this very thing in terms of real answers and possible understanding. Why? Because I'm rather desperate in understanding the question why, not what. What exactly we know, and we can find better ways of recording it and approaching and touching, etc. But the question why is probably the only one which interests us today about history. I don't find history for its own sake interesting, frankly, at all. I find it rather boring. And what I find interesting is what I'm interested in now, or what we seem to be facing today. And these are not just political problems, not just economic, and not just etc. It is something which is much more profound, and something which is much more, I would say, timeless than something like a particular circumstances of a, situation which can be described in political terms. I never seen, and nobody can convince me so far, that any of the things which we are usually talking about as architects can be really understood or very profoundly understood through political interpretations. It is certainly illuminating or enlightening as a dimension of the problem, fine, but as an answer, it usually ends up very shortly before saying anything very profound.
No, so what I meant was I'm not suggesting that not only use listening to I was suggesting that you didn't actually show dialectic the relationship between you consider to be the normal stuff, which I consider to be ideas, and more materialist interpretation of the sorts of things which you're talking about.
Because it stems obviously from the belief. Yes, I understand and I agree. It stems from the belief. I see all the points you're making, and I would appreciate them, I accept them, but I see it as a circle. I don't see it as one coming from the other. I see it as a circle, and to me, so far, the beginning of the circle appears to be really in the sphere where something begins to happen, and it is really with the gesture, it is with the intention, it is with the, call it idea if you like. In that sense, I'm perfectly happy to be an idealist, because I do believe that it is after all the attempt to go beyond the given that makes things moving. And if you call it will, if you call it desire, if you call it just spontaneity, fine, doesn't matter. But it is from something like that anything happens. And I'm interested rather looking at the circle first from that point of view before going into other aspects. I agree that it would be interesting to go through some kind of a dialectic, but it will be a multiplied dialectics and will turn into a different issue than lecture or different kind of event than just a short talk. So I would say I did not intend to do that, if nothing than time reasons, and rather put finger on something which I find myself interesting enough, controversial enough, and up to date or provocative for us, 1976, enough to look at more closely and more, maybe, provocatively, if you like. If I can disguise, I didn't say in the beginning, because I would probably start moving into a very, very, very kind of difficult territory, and I avoided the question which I'm really interested most in, the current discussion and the current kind of pessimism and optimism seems to still refer, or always refer in the end, to something like the existence, legitimacy, or death of the discipline. If I can quote directly from someone like Tafuri, it would be the death of architecture as a key notion of the current discourse. I find it puzzling and extremely difficult to understand or read on the surface value, because I still haven't come across anything which would indicate what is meant by any of those two words, especially the second one. And I find it then absolutely absurd to start or even wrote books on issue which seems to me very, very obscure indeed. To put it simply, how can one talk about death of the discipline if one is not trying even to say what the discipline itself might mean? I'm not saying what it means or what it is, nothing like definition, but at least indication, what is it that we are really referring to? And maybe that the whole debate, the whole atmosphere of discourse would change very substantially if we rather take seriously our first words than continuing very easily into second sentence and making a big conclusions from something which is not clear right at the beginning. But this is a question which I have been asking myself and rather left underneath my talk today, and hopefully perhaps the debate would return to. I don't know, I was deliberately very provocative and so I hope that there will be, if not now, at least sometimes in future, just tomorrow, not today.
Did I understand you to say that you weren't interested in history, in the historical steps of architecture, rather that you were interested existentially at what's happening now? Is that correct?
You see, if I can refer to that which I only introduced and very quickly, briefly commented on, the word vertical, I can answer your question simply saying, yes, I accept the aspect of moment of whatever I've been saying, but I would like to understand it as a vertical history, not as a horizontal one, which means not referring from events to events, causes, etc., but rather referring to what has been sedimented underneath, what has been, as it were, replaced, what has been constituted above the historically given, and what in the end creates or makes our presence what it is.
Yes, I can see that. And it was very clear. Thank you very much. But I thought the most interesting parts of your lecture were, one, that architecture is non-figurative, which gives one the whole clue to the whole passé of the Beaux-Arts, which is the figurative art. I don't mean decorated with figures, but integrated like a human figure. And the second thing was the one-to-one. And I'd like to ask you to open up on that situation, because it seems to me that the one-to-one syndrome is one of the major stultifying obstacles in the whole of the modern movement. And curious enough, in architecture, unlike moral life, it's so easy to gain your innocence and so difficult to lose it. But in moral life, of course, it's the other way around. And the revivalism today seems to be an attempt to regain a lost experience in the light of the innocence gained through the 19th century and coming to flower in the 20s and 30s. That innocence which I admire, but one does not want. And it's, if you have a revivalism, would you agree that this involves it involves a selection, and this involves a selective academism, which you cannot admit. And therefore the question of any form of revivalism, having gained your innocence, is extremely difficult.
So I would just comment very briefly, saying that, to me at least, it doesn't seem to be any kind of contradiction as it is established so far in the historical interpretation, between, say, 19th century École Polytechnique tradition and the Beaux-Arts tradition. You know, what is considered to be the progressive stream in the 19th and 20th century is exactly the same, or vice versa. Beaux-Arts tradition has accepted, and we are still not fully aware of it, 3/4 of the premises and assumptions, and have been sharing the framework of the, you know, what people like Pevsner, etc., would consider to be the progressive line. What I mean very specifically is that the Beaux-Arts is a mathematization of the visible, iconic if you like, or figurative, while the progressive is a mathematization of the invisible, dealing directly with the functional, dealing directly with the relational, etc., etc., while the Beaux-Arts would always tend to deal with the tangibles, with the definable, almost iconic, as it were, vocabulary. One can only refer to someone like Durand and his recueil, you know, his attempt to formulate something like a universal encyclopedia of forms, and the permanent revival of that very typology until De Rossi makes it another issue again. And on the other side, the development as we know it, second half 19th, early 20th century, and labeled as functionalism, rather misunderstood on both sides, and more as missing the point, which is common to both, and which probably is really the source of the problem as we are still dealing with it even today, which means the possibility of a, as it were, mathematization in the end of the sphere which we traditionally call architecture. What it means today is, of course, another open question, but at least in terms of the recent history, it already doesn't appear as clear as we have been used to. And the two sides, the side of the Beaux-Arts, the side of the traditional or revivalistic side of the 19th, 20th century, is in the end very much, and sometimes even more, I would like to say even more. I didn't talk, and I expected that someone would just respond to my allusions, current debates between the structuralist and the non-structuralist, the whole paraphernalia of current architectural semiology, etc., which more or less continues the attempt of rather mathematical dreams of a meaning. I don't want to use my last word about that issue, but if it sounds provocative enough, I would like to use it, that in the end, one is not providing an alternative to a technology of architecture, but rather substituting with technology of meaning of architecture. In other words, it is really a disguised technology of meaning, not meaning itself.
Can you say anything about the evaporation of memory in architecture, which seems to be the most interesting phenomenon of the 19th and 20th century?
You see, yeah.
Because this really is one of the central issues.
Yes. You see, it probably comes from the very approach I have taken for the talk today. To some it seemed to be ahistorical, but it was deliberately so because the history has been, in fact, as it were, subordinated to what one can call a theoretical. I just used straight away the word the mathematical. You know, the notion of Colin Rowe, mathematics of ideal villa, I would still tend to see as much more broader notion which applies to more than just an individual building in a particular tradition. It is much more fundamental and profound problem. And it was through that I was trying to talk, as it were, simultaneously about both, about the historical context and about the presence, which means in its historical theoretical, if you like, at the same time. I don't know if I understood your question, but...
I'm sure you did. Then I would ask you one last thing, which I'm a layman, I'm not an architect. Would you say that the modern movement was the last phenomenon of Cartesianism in worked out before one's eyes? The whole thought structure behind the modern movement was Cartesian. And can one oppose V-curvism, if I can call it that, to this. As you know, V-curve is very much in people's thoughts now. And the whole dissolution Cartesianism, divided by the V-curve, is engaging people's imagination. And perhaps this is parallel to this idea, which is so difficult, and I think it's impossible, of revivalism, of the revival aspect in certain types of modern art.
I mean, my answer again would be very relatively simple. I would say that, the question if the modern movement is or not is rather not a question, it's a fact. It is a part of a Cartesian culture, and we are still part of it. I'm not a prophet to say when it will end up. There are symptoms that it's coming to some kind of a exhaustion. But what will substitute it, we still don't know. There are anticipation possibilities of some genuine, authentic alternatives around. Nevertheless, we are still living a Cartesian culture. And I find it rather amusing, the kind of debates about the possibility of substituting it, as it were, tomorrow, or talking about a non-Cartesian culture. You see, I'm very open about that, and I'm very, as it were, enthusiastic about any possibilities which would really bring it in the sphere of architecture to the same level at least, where already thinking is. And what you're referring to, of course, is so far anticipation through thinking. And, the Cartesian tradition has its Pascalian tradition, as it were, and Vico probably might not be on that line, but the 20th century is full of the non-Cartesian thinking. One can only see it in France, especially in continent, and it's difficult to say which one is stronger so far. The attempts, of course, are very limited, because one thing, and that's what I would end up saying, I believe in, that one can only get through, certainly not around. And I find it amusing, especially in our sphere, when people talking about going beyond modern movement, in fact never being through. And especially on the Anglo-Saxon sort of scene, I find it double amusing, because half the people who are making those radical conclusions never, in fact, attempted to understand what has been really involved. And that's a point where I just rather leave it to someone else to continue. But I would end up with what I said. I believe that one can go only through. It is something to be dealt with by head and not by foot to be kicked out. It has to be thought through, dealt with, and, as it were, one has to create his own way through what is given. And it's like talking about any previous decisive period in history and saying we can go around or beyond. There is something which is unavoidable, and one has to only accept it in order to really go beyond. And that's what I would say about the Cartesian tradition.
I was very interested in your introducing the Postman's Knock, the fantastic building in the centre of France, which really anticipates surrealistic painting by 100 years, or what is 1870, that building, by 50 years. And it's the flight of the memory into the fantasy. And I cannot believe that is an interesting pathological situation, but I can't believe that it has anything really contributory to our modern situation now.
Well, I've been using it actually in that very sense, showing rather the perhaps ultimate naivete of believing that this stream might produce some kind of a foundation. It becomes much more difficult to understand when one is dealing with people like Hugo Herring, Sharon, or the more influential members of the Expressionist generation. And it becomes almost, for us at least today, impossible to see clearly when it comes to someone like our Alto, to what extent the very intelligent, in terms of intuitive intelligence and updating of certain profound elements of the vernacular tradition can really sustain the problem or can cope with the dilemma, which I've been briefly outlining. The current stream and tendencies in states, which are very strong, especially in the provincial schools of architecture and territories or areas, to develop, or as it were, cultivate some of the vernacular tendencies, and on a much more successful level, repeat Venturi or continue Webline, seems to be so far, again, rather doomed to failure for reasons which, again, are slightly more complicated, but some of them, hopefully, I have been already making.